Uh, it's a great honor to be with you today and deliver this lecture in honor of Professor Brajadulal Chattopadhaya, who passed away a few months ago, 5 months ago on the 13th of July. In JNU, Professor Chattopadhyay was called Brajo. He was also called BDC. Brajoda retired from service in JNU in 2004. He offered a course on epigraphy in the winter semester that year. I was a second semester MA student at the CHS and I had registered for this course. It was a core course for students of ancient history. As it turned out, unlike the other students in the class, I happened to develop an extremely friendly relationship with him. There were two reasons for this. One, I was older than most other students in the class by several years because I was pursuing another career for a while before coming to academics. I already had a fair measure of gray hair, Atik can tell you. Two, I had some familiarity with inscriptions in Karnataka, especially of the Kalyana Chalukya and the Hoysala period, partly the Rashtrakuta period as well. I had of course read only the texts that appeared in print, the texts that appeared in edited forms. I couldn't read the stamp pages. I had not learned epigraphy until then. Not that I have a mastery over it now, but then being in academics for a while, one certainly learns how to be pretentious, how to use keywords and jargon. So in that sense, I know my inscriptions fairly well. Brajoda had developed an interest in Karnataka inscriptions, largely due to his long-term friendship with S. Shettar, which began in Cambridge in the early 1970s, and also because he happened to supervise the MPhil thesis of Ashok Shettar, who knew the Karnataka inscriptions like the back of his hand. So Brajoda would often ask me for the meaning of a Kannada word that occurred in the inscriptions. For instance, he once asked me what the word Balgarchu meant. I told him that Bal was life. It also meant living in an economic sense and was an equivalent of Jivita used in several other Karnataka inscriptions in a similar context. And Karchu was washing or pouring, an equivalent of the Dhara Purvaka that you find in Sanskrit inscriptions. The inscription suggests that Bargarchu was a land tenure and had the quality of what we now call a pension. Brajoda then brought to my attention some writings in which Bal was translated as a sword. I told him that the word Val meant a sword in Tamil and Malayalam. And because the initial Va in Tamil appeared as Ba in Kannada from very early times, Val can indeed become Bal. And in this sense, Bal was a sword. But I also added that one doesn't really come across attested examples, actual examples for the use of Bal to mean a sword. And besides, Balgarchu was a land tenure. The sword need not appear in the name of a tenure, you see. This was one of the several conversations that we had in 2004. And then he retired from service, and I left JNU to work full time on a research fellowship awarded by the Ministry of Culture, the Government of India. And then I think I met him only once. Yeah, only once. Where was that? I forget. That was at the Indian History Congress in December 2014, held in JNU. This was the 75th session, and he was the general president of the session. One could, of course, speak about a number of aspects that one finds in Brajoda's works. He engaged with questions concerning the political economy. He wrote a history of coins and currency systems in South India. He wrote about literature. He wrote about intellectual life, about ideas. But for the purposes of the talk today, here's what is important from me. Brajoda was one of the few historians in India who tried to understand the urban world as well as the rural world in what is now called the early medieval period. And today, I want to share some thoughts which speak to this particular theme. I'll focus on a city and a village from Kerala. The city is Kollam or Koilan as it is often written in English. This is a port city about 70 kilometers north of Thiruvananthapuram. 70 kilometers by the shortest route that was in use in pre-colonial times. The route is actually described in a late 14th century text, the Unnunneeli Sandesham, which is a messenger poem modeled after the famous Meghaduta. That's Kollam. And the village that I'm looking at is Tiruvalla, which again by the shortest route in pre-colonial times is about 70 kilometers to the north of Kollam. Tiruvalla is an inland settlement and a major town in Kerala today. It is also it's also an important seat of the Malankara Syrian Church in Kerala. The Syrian Church has several rival factions, and their rivalry is legendary, so to speak. The one that dominates the affairs in Tiruvalla is the Marthoma faction or the St. Thomas faction. And Tiruvalla is also where we get the oldest surviving information on Kollam. Not the whole of it, but half of the information. That's actually a story in its own right. The oldest document on Kollam is the Darisapalli copper plate grant, which is also called the Syrian Christian copper plates, and at times as the Kollam copper plates, Kottayam copper plates, and so on. It's also identified rather whimsically, I must say, as Tabula Culonensis. This was a grant made in the year 849 to a church, which seems to have been a Persian church. Now, here's what happened. In 1599, the Portuguese made the church in Kerala subordinate to the Archdiocese of Goa, which was in turn affiliated to the Latin Church. This happened at the famous or infamous Synod of Udayamperur. There was a reaction against this shift sometime later. This happened at Mattanjeri near Kochi in 1653. Many Kerala Christians decided to break with the Latin Church and also free themselves of whatever Jesuit influence they might have had. They argued that they were reverting back to their original church. But as it turned out, it was the Syrian church which they now chose to affiliate with. They chose to go with the Syrian church that was headquartered in Antioch. Perhaps because in the 17th century, the Persian church did not exist in the form in which it did until the early 14th century. Perhaps because only the Syrian church had a well-defined identity after the schism of 1552 in the so-called Church of the East. Perhaps because the Syrian church had the greatest antiquity claim. We know that Peter the Apostle founded a church in Antioch. The Syrian church actually traces its origin to this event. And it was in Antioch that the word Christians was used for the first times. We have it in the Bible itself in Acts 11. Now, whatever the reason, they were now called the Syrian Christians or the Malankara Syrian Christians. Malankara is another word for Kerala, something like Malabar. Now, following a series of disputes within the Malankara Syrian church that began in the first half of the 19th century, there was a rift between two factions, the Marthoma faction and the Orthodox faction. And among the things that the two factions divided between themselves, among the property that they divided between themselves, were also the Tarisapalli copper plates. So half of the copper plates are now in the Devaloka Maramana near Kottayam, which belongs to the Orthodox faction. The remaining half is in Tiruvalla, which belongs to the Marthoma faction. But both of them have no legitimate claims over this artifact because it originally belonged to the Persian church. So it's this divided artifact, as it were, that I'll be using to discuss Kollam. And my discussion of Tiruvalla is based on the Tiruvalla copper plates, which was called the Huzur Treasury copper plates when it was first published in the early 20th century. This is a voluminous document. In fact, it's rich enough for a PhD thesis. It happens to be a kind of compilation made sometime in the 12th or the 13th century, and it records a number of grants made between the 9th and the 12th century to the Tiruvalla temple. One could call it a kind of copper plate equivalent or counterpart of the Ahar and Siadoni stone inscriptions, which Prajoda had commented upon in one of his papers. But the Tiruvalla plates are much longer and record a much larger number of grants. There are 43 plates with the text appearing on them in about 630 lines. A few plates are of course lost. We don't have the first few plates of this set. The Tarisapalli plates, by contrast, are less than eighth of the Tiruvalla plates by size. There are only 5 plates. Four of them carry details of the grant, and the fifth plate gives a list of witnesses to the grant. So there is an asymmetry, as you can see, as far as the extent of data that is available. But there is asymmetry at another level. The Tadisapalli copper plates tell us of things that happened in the 4th and the 5th decade of the 9th century, things that occurred between 830 and 850. But the Tiruvalla copper plates contain data for a longer period, apparently up to the end of the 12th century. Now, before I tell you what the copper plates are all about and why they're important for us, I want to spend a few minutes shedding light on the use of the city and the village as categories and how useful they are in the context that we are looking at, which is southern Kerala in the from the 9th through the 12th century. There were a few cities in Kerala during this period: Thiruvananthapuram, Kollam, Kodungalur, or Mahodayapuram as it was called, Valapattanam, and so on. I'm not sure if one can identify Thiruvananthapuram as a city in this period. It certainly becomes an important city by the 14th century, but it doesn't seem to have been of much consequence until the 12th century. Kollam and the other cities, Valapattanam, Kodungalur, these were certainly important cities. They were major port cities. Besides, Kerala had an urban imagination or a set of templates with which to imagine a city. So it was easy to identify a city. The city was provided with three things. I'm speaking of the city in Kerala. They were provided with three things. One, a wall, that is a citadel. Two, a permanent market and not the periodic fair. So this would make it resemble like the medieval market that Max Weber is describing. And three, a political authority. By political authority, I don't mean a representative or functionary of the state. I don't mean the administrative apparatus of the city either. So what I mean is the presence of an autochthonous family or lineage of warlords who exercised political and economic control over the city. These might have been autochthonous families or lineages or houses of chiefs who were subordinate to the state. We don't actually come across autochthonous warlords controlling cities in the 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th century. We find them in the 14th and 15th century. What we have in our period are chiefs who are enlisted into the service of the Chera state as the Samantas. Now, this description might not make sense in other parts of India. A permanent market is, of course, something that one could insist upon, but not a citadel. Not a citadel. Cities were, of course, fortified, but there were other fortified centers that were military garrisons or nodes of revenue collection. These were simply identified as forts and not as cities. And these forts existed in some numbers. For instance, the historian A.V. Narasimhamurthy has identified 84 such forts in the territories controlled by the Sevunas or the Yadavas of Devagiri between about, say, 1175 and 1325 or 30. Nobody is claiming that these were 84 cities. And the existence of an autochthonous line of warlords is certainly not an essential feature of a city in other parts of the subcontinent. In Kerala, as it turns out, there is a line of warlords or chiefs who control the affairs of a city in this period. We now have a sense of what a city is, which is not true. I'll come to that in a moment, but let's assume that we know what a city was. Now, what was a village? This is a tricky question in the context of Kerala. Why? Because Kerala, due to the nature of its physical geography, did not develop nucleated village settlements, such as the ones that you find in other parts of India. So what existed in Kerala were estates of landed families on which a handful of cultivators lived. A handful of cultivators, and in a number of instances, slaves as well. There is no village, so to speak, but there is a village that is spoken of in the inscriptions. It is called the Ur, and it's also called Ur in the neighboring Tamil Nadu and Karnataka as well. Now, what is this village or Ur in a region that did not have nucleated rural settlements? Uh, the data suggests that it was an area consisting of a group of estates or agrarian land holdings centering on an institution. The institution, you know very well, it's a temple, and the landed magnates were called Urar. The word Urar means people of the village, and the people of the village are the ones who owned land in the village, either collectively or individually. So the phrase people of the village does not refer to all the inhabitants of the settlement, it only refers to the landowners. And the village is the land or the extent of land owned by the landowners. So, in this sense, the village in Kerala was not different from the village in the neighboring Tamil Nadu as far as who the people of the village were was concerned. So, the difference was that the village was a nucleated settlement in Tamil Nadu, but this was not the case in Kerala. What then was the city in Kerala? The answer, I think, is pretty simple. A city is a nucleated settlement as opposed to the village, which is not a nucleated settlement. And the nucleated nature of the city was characterized by the three things that I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago. A citadel, a lineage of warlords exercising control over its affairs, and a permanent market. The number of lineages multiply in later times, and by the 16th century you have a very strange situation. Claims over the city becomes deeply contested, but the broad essentials remain pretty much the same. And I believe that it is the permanent market that marked out a city as distinct from other forms of settlement, because the citadel and the warlord lineages were present elsewhere too. Kollam had a market. We can infer this from the sidelights that the Tharisapalli copper plates shed. But there is a rich description of the Kollam market in the 14th century text, Ullunili Sandesham. There is no market in Tiruvalla. A market in Tiruvalla figures nowhere in the voluminous Tiruvalla copper plates. It is not there in the Unnunili Sandesham either. In fact, the Unnunili Sandesham categorically states that people from all over the world assemble in the outskirts of Tiruvalla to sell their products, but by late afternoon, the whole place is deserted. So the text is obviously referring to a fair, perhaps a daily fair, and not a weekly or a monthly fair. Now, we could extend this understanding to Tamil Nadu or Karnataka or Andhra. I'll give you a couple of examples. Compare Lokki Gundi, which is now called Lakkundi, with Puligere, known as Salakshmeshwara now. Compare the two of them. One doesn't really find a difference in political terms or in terms of economic transactions between the two places. But Lakkundi was a village, a great village, Mahagrama as it is called. But Lakshmeshwara was called a city. There is a major difference though. Lakkundi did not have a permanent market, Puligere had one. Another example that comes to mind immediately is Uttaramerur in Tamil Nadu. It was a center of exceptional importance in Pallava times, but it was called a village. And then there was Ukkirangotai, which was hardly a patch on Uttaramerur, but it was identified as a city. Now read Brajoda's piece on cities such as the Gopagiri or Tattanandapura or Siyadoni, and read his piece on the village of Kalikatti in Karnataka. One doesn't really figure out how the one was different from the other, except that Kalikatti had no permanent market. So this is a deeply complicated situation, and I don't think we really understand why such important centers as Tiruvalla or Lakkundi or Uttarameru did not have permanent markets. Now, this is an essentialist understanding of the city, and I don't have a problem with it when the data is leading us to this understanding. The problem is when we accept this definition at face value and theorize the city accordingly without probing into what I believe are questions of greater importance. Why do we have these defining indicators? That's one question. And why were they put in place, and by whom? That's another. Now, the work that I'm currently doing suggests that from about the 9th century, perhaps a little earlier, there begins to emerge a tension between agrarian entrepreneurship and the market. This is because of the rise of a strong mercantile class that makes a variety of investments in land, which is to say they acquire land as owners, they acquire land as tenants at will, or as perpetual hereditary tenants, or as revenue farmers. So until about the 9th century, markets seem to have been controlled by the peasant proprietors. And this continues in the following centuries too, to a certain extent. But now there is an increase in the involvement of merchants in the market as well as in land relations. So it has consequences for land relations. And land relations also means market relations to a certain extent. I think so much is clear from what I've said just now. It also has consequence for the question of labor. It has consequence for the question of labor because the peasant proprietors have a militia, and so do the corporate body of merchants such as Manigramam, Ayyavale, Ainyuttuvar, Valanjiyar, Mumuridanda, and so on. There is a body of troops attached to them. The militia of the peasant proprietors are obviously drawn from within the peasantry of the respective villages or localities. The militia attached to the mercantile groups are also drawn from the peasantry, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. So what I'm suggesting is that a part of the military labor is now coming from a section of the population that is detached from agrarian labor. It brings into being a supralocal realm for the circulation of labor, and in this case, it is the realm of military labor in service of mercantile corporations. So it is this supralocal realm of military labor that comes to be occupied by the military labor entrepreneurs called the Nayakas between the 15th and the 18th century. See, the connection I'm drawing is with respect to the circulation of military labor. I'm not arguing that the Nayakas were successors to the troops attached to the trading groups such as Manigramam or Mumuridanda. The argument is that the merchant bodies opened up a space for supralocal circulation of military labor, and this space comes to be occupied in later centuries by the Nayakas. So we then have an extremely complex story of land and market relations and labor relations that political decision made in this context. I think we have to come to terms with this fact rather than expending our energies in producing reified definitions and descriptions of the city. I think it's time to get to Kollam now. Uh, Kollam was the headquarters of the southernmost chiefdom in the Chera state. It was the headquarters of the Vale chiefs, and the chiefdom was known after them as Venad. The first recorded evidence of Kollam as well as Venadu comes from the Tarisapalli copper plates. We have no information concerning Kollam before the 9th century. But some event which took place here in 824 was momentous in some senses. Now, what this event was and in what senses it was momentous, we do not know. But at least since the late 10th century, Kerala has had its own calendar, which begins in the year 824. And this era is called the Kollam era. The calendar is still in use in Kerala. We are now in Kollam era 1198. And today is the 29th of Vrishchigam. Vrishchigam is today is the 27th, sorry, 27th of Vrishchigam. Vrishchigam is the 4th month of the year. Now, by the time the Tarisapalli grant was made, which was made in the 5th regnal year of Stanu Ravi, who is the earliest known Chera king, that would be the year 849. By this time, Kollam had become a major port in the Indian Ocean maritime network. Abu Zaid writes about the port in the year 851. He calls the city Kulam or Kulam Mali. He gives us some interesting bits of information about Kollam. He says that the voyage from Muscat to Kollam across the Arabian Sea took about a month's time when the winds were favorable. And after Muscat, this was the place where ships traveling further east would refill their freshwater reserve. Now, Chinese ships paid a duty of 1,000 dirhams at the port of Kollam, and other ships paid anywhere between a dinar and 10 dinars. So the dinar is a gold coin, and the dirham is a silver coin. Now, sometime before 849, a church was built in Kollam. The church was called Tarisapalli, that is to say, the Church of Tarisa. Now, what is Tarisa? We don't know. It might refer to Tarsa, which was an Abbasid city in Turkey, which points to some connections with Anatolia, or it might refer to an unknown saint, Teresa. Now, the Tarisapalli plates tell us that the church was built by a certain Yesodata Pirai, and the Tarisapalli plates tell us that the church was built Sapirisho several times. Now, historians generally believe that it is Sapirisho who built the church and that he was more is known about them. There have been many speculations, though. Most historians think that Sapirisho was a merchant. There is, in fact, a 19th century text called the Niranam Granthavari, which speaks of a merchant called Savarishu, who came to Kerala in the year 825. There are also legends about two bishops, Mar Sapor and Mar Proth or Afroth, who are thought to have visited Kerala. Now, some writers think that Sapir missionary. Uh, now, uh, Now, part of the problem is that historians have almost unanimously, accepted Tarisapalli as a Syrian church. Now, all we need to do to get a better picture or a different picture is to move to other parts of India's west coast and see what influences these places were subjected to, what Christian influences. And we soon realized that this was the influence of the Persian church. And when we look at 9th century sources containing information on the Persian church, I'm afraid I'm not equipped enough to look at these sources. I have only consulted secondary sources here. So when we look at them, we learn that from 831 to 835, the head of the Persian church, that is the Catholics, who is the Persian church equivalent of Pope in the Roman church. The head of the Persian church was Sabrisho II, and he was succeeded by Abraham of Marga. And one of Abraham's potential successors was Ishodad of Mer, who was a renowned biblical commentator of the 9th century and the bishop of Adata. Yeshodad couldn't make it the office of the Catholicos because when Abraham of Marga died in 853, the Caliph Al-Tawakil chose to intervene into the affairs of the church and appointed Theodosius as Catholicos. Now, it's my guess, this is an informed guess as you can see, it's my guess that Sapirisho was Sabrisho II and Yeshodata was Ishodad of Mer. And Ishodad built the church on behalf of Sabrisho II. The Tiruvalla copper plates record the grants made to the Sri Vallabha temple or the Tiruvallavar temple as it was called. Now, we don't know how old this temple is. We hear of it for the first time from the works of Nammalvar, the Alvar saint in the 8th century. So the Cheras of Mahodayapuram had enlisted the realms of 10 hereditary warlord families into their service. So the warlord chiefs ruled over localities called the Nadas. The Cheras also carved out 3 Nadas of their own, perhaps for administrative convenience. These were not hereditary localities, but they were placed under the charge of one or other of the hereditary chiefs. Tiruvalla was perhaps the headquarters of one of these non-hereditary Nadas, the Nandurai Nadu. Tiruvalla or Chenganur, which is 9 kilometers southeast of Tiruvalla. One of these was the Nandurai Nadu headquarters. Now, the Cheras entrusted Nandurai Nadu's administration to the Kollam-based Venadu chiefs. Now, the Tarisapalli plates record the grants that were made by the Venadu chief, Adigal Tiruvadi, to the church. The grant was, I believe, seen as a major event in Chera history. At least this is the sense that one gets from the number of people who are present when the deed was executed. The Cheras themselves sent a representative, Vijayaraga, who was an important figure in the state politics. So he went on to become king 34 years later. There is also a chief of the junior line of the Venadu family that is present in this transaction. So it's likely that he was the father of Rama Rajashekara, who succeeded to the Chera throne. Two from Kerala who were present. One of them, Sundaran, was a member of the Venadu line of chiefs. Two others, Adhikarar and Pragrati, as they are were representatives of the state. There were leaders of two adjoining settlements, Punai Talaipadi and Boradi. A representative each of the Anjuvannam and Manigramam were also present. These were both trading groups. And then there was the commander of a militia consisting of 600 troops. That's the Arunutwa. Now, the deed was also witnessed by 25 men from West Asia. They were Arab Muslims, there were Christians among them, there were Jews. I believe some of them were also Zoroastrians. So their names are recorded in the copper plates in Kufic, Hebrew, and Pahlavi scripts. Now, the grant made to the church was huge, really huge. To church. The copper plate actually mentions four toddy tapper families, four peasant families, two salt maker families, and a family each of carpenters and launderers. And all of these families, or at least some of them, might have employed people to serve them. In fact, the copper plates speak of 8 families that were serving the Iravas, that were serving the toddy tappers. Now, all these families were apparently in the service of the Venadu chiefs. The Tarisapalli plates transfer the launderers, the toddy tappers, and the people serving the toddy tappers to the church. And all revenues that were due from them are also transferred to the church. It includes a wide range of dues, a crazy range of dues actually. There is something called Talai Kanam, which is a fees to be paid for using an ankle band. You know, an ankle band that is used for climbing a palm tree for toddy tapping. There is also something called Eni Kanam, which is a fee for using a ladder for toddy tapping. There is Mane Mepan Kullumirai, which is a fees that one pays for permission to lay a thatched roof on the hut. There is Chandran Mata. We don't know what this really was. It might have been a fees for gathering firewood. It might also be a fees for lighting a lamp at home. And then there was Iravuchoru, billeting. There was Pudanari, which is a measure of toddy paid as dues for every pot of toddy sold. And then the gold which these families had, that is gold held as capital, Menipunna, and the interest on it, Polipunna. These were also made over to the church. The church was granted a number of other dues as well. There was the head price and the breast price, Talai Vilai and Mulai Vilai, so which were actually fees payable for having a male slave and a female slave. There was Ulka or Shulka, which was the transit toll. There was also the Arivulka, which was the customs duty, the duty on goods coming through the sea. The transit toll on toddy was actually accounted separately. It's called the Kalluvarattilulka. We also come across something like Aruvadilondrulka. So this is a 60th share paid as transit toll. I think this was the toll paid for transporting paddy. There was also something called Alkach, which is a fee that you pay for acquiring a slave. And this fee was exempted for people who were associated with the church. Now, the boundaries of the land are also mentioned in the Tarisapalli copper plates. The details here are fairly limited, and we have no means to quantify the extent of land. But as I said earlier, it was simply huge. One has to pay 8 kash for entering the fortified area by road, and 4 kash for entering it by a boat. And a small boat is mentioned, ready, and also a large boat is mentioned. The part of both fine mentioned there. So that must give you a sense of how large the area given to the church actually was. That's not the end of it. There was also land revenue. The king received a 10th share of the produce. This was the Koppadavaram. The landowner received a tenth share from the tenant. This was the Patipadawaram. The king retained his share, but the landowner's share was now transferred to the trading groups, Anjuvannam and Manigrama. And there were also other dues. There was weighing balances at the toll collection points. A fee was prescribed for using the balances. This is the Tula Kuli. And there were perhaps people who filled the vessels or containers in the balances, filled paddy perhaps, and a filling fee was collected for this purpose. This was the Nirai Kuli. And some of the weights and measures that the Venadu chief had kept with him, such as Varakolu and Painjakandi, were also handed over to the church. So this rather extensive information is pointing to something that I believe is of great interest for students of economic history. A large amount of money and other resources, including toddy, is placed at the service of the church. And this income is not in the form of new wealth that is created. The income is not in the form of profit from production and sales or in the form of wages. It is in the form of extraction or appropriation from the wealth that is already there. That is appropriation in the form of tax, rent, and interest. In other words, this is a rent-seeking economy. Let's now go to Tiruvalla. Before that, I must make another point. There is so much money in Kollam, as we've just seen, coined money. And we know from Abu Zaid that the dinar and the dirham were also in circulation in Kollam. But there is no money in Tiruvalla, no coined money. What we have are paddy and gold. So, if you are Ram Sharan Sharma, welcome to Tiruvalla, and you will find material to argue that there was a paucity of metallic currency in this period. And if you are John Dale, stay away from Tiruvalla. Kollam is a better place for you. In any case, the whole debate on the paucity of coined money is based on cherry-picked evidence that is almost completely insensitive to the complexity on the ground and characterized by a rather pedestrian understanding of the process of monetization, as if monetization is all about the physical circulation of money. Now, please don't construe that the evidence from Kerala points to the use of money in a city, Kollam, and its absence in a village, Tiruvalla. That is not the case. The Varapalli grant of Rama Rajashekara, for example, this is from the year 882-83. This grant speaks of the use of dinar. And Varapalli is a village, just 12 kilometers to the north of Tiruvalla. So now the grants that were made to the Tiruvalla temple were meant for specific services, such as lighting perpetual lamps, the celebrating Onam and Vishu, feeding brahmanas, making payments to temple functionaries, which was often in the form of vritti, which in this context was a service tenure. The grants were in the form of a specific share of paddy from a designated plot of land. In some instances, land grants were also made. The King Bhaskara Ravi, for example, gives a plot of land in Kainkari with a sowing capacity of 2,000 columns. A column is roughly 80 kgs. Then 2,000 column is what? 2,000 into 80, 20,000 into 8, 1,60,000. So it's a plot of 160 ton sowing capacity. Now, some of the grants were in the form of interests on loan. In one such instance, a woman from Ilangundranadu, who happens to be a dancer, obtained a loan of gold and paid the interest as paddy. So this paddy was granted to the temple. In one case, the chief of Vembalanadu, Ravi Srikandan, gave a settlement called Kudavur, along with its market and the 18 taxes that were collected from here. So now in most instances in Tiruvalla, the temple is placing its lands on tenancy, and the tenant pays a rent. It's called partam. So it is this rent that is given as grant for services such as lighting lamps and feeding. Now, the grants given to Tiruvalla temple were not always from within Tiruvalla or its immediate surroundings. One of the grants, for instance, is from Chennithala, which is 16 kilometers to the south of Tiruvalla. There's also a place called Kuruchi, which had similar connections with the temple, and Kuruchi is 18 kilometers to the north of Tiruvalla. Tamarakulam is 32 kilometers to the south of Tiruvalla. So Kuruchi and Tamarakulam are among the 20 settlements named in the Tiruvalla plates, which supplied oil to the temple for the Vishu celebrations. Temples were in need of huge supply of oil back then because they had to maintain the perpetual lamps. So these are lamps that are not allowed to blow out. So the lamps are meant, among other things, for maintaining fire. And maintaining fire was really important. If the fire is gone, one has to kindle again, and that's not easy. One has to churn a long cylindrical piece of wood against a flat block of wood that has a little depression in it. One churns and churns, and when there is some heat generated, one places some grass on it, which catches fire. It's laborious. It's laborious. Doing this on a daily basis is not impossible, but maintaining fire is a labor-saving practice. So the easiest way to maintain fire is to have lamps in the perpetual lamps in the temples, and that requires gallons and gallons of oil. And oil came to Tiruvalla from 20 settlements. Obviously, then Tiruvalla was a large settlement. It also had a school, a shala, perhaps for Vedic education and military training. Most of the shalas back then combined their secular and religious education with military training. There's a grant made to the school, about 350 naris of paddy. Nari is a measure. About 350 naris of paddy was granted for feeding the students of the school on Onam. Now, the daily allowance for a student is 2 naris. We know this from inscriptions elsewhere. And based on this information, Keshavan Veluthat suggests that the school had about 175 students, which is quite a number. 175 for the 10th and 11th centuries, quite a number. There was also a hospital attached to it. It's called the Athurashala. We also have examples of Athurashala from Tamil Nadu. Now, the importance of Tiruvalla temple is borne out by several facts. We know of a grant made by a merchant who came from Sri Lanka. Grants were made by several hereditary chiefs from Kerala, including the Kolathanadu chief Ramagadamur, whose chiefdom, Kolathanadu, was in northern Malabar, very close to Kannur. The Puragidar Nadu chief made a grant here. Puragidar Nadu is also in northern Malabar to the southeast of Kolathanadu. I've already said about the Vembala Nadu chief, Ravi Srikandan. The chiefs of two other Nadus, Munji Nadu and Keelmalai Nadu, also made grants here. And the Vayanadu chief was, of course, administering the Nadu in which Tiruvalla is located, Tandurai Nadu. So this is of no mean consequence, as you can see. Chiefs from 6 of the 10 hereditary chiefdoms are here in Tiruvalla making grants. And that isn't all. Veera Chola makes a grant here for lighting a lamp. Veera Chola is the Chola king Parantaka I. Now that's about Tiruvalla and Kollam. There appears to be a sea of difference between Tiruvalla and Kollam as far as the economic transactions are concerned. In Kollam, it's a transit toll, customs duty, and a wide variety of fees that constitute the major source of income. There is land revenue, there is interest on loan, there are taxes, but they don't seem to be bringing as much income as transit toll, customs duty, and the fees are bringing. So in Tiruvalla, the land which the temple holds, or which the temple owns, and the lion's share of the income comes from the rent received from the tenants. There is income coming from interest on loans and from a range of taxes. There is also income coming from the market of Kudavur. But the paddy received as rent is the mainstay of the temple's income. Nevertheless, what is common to both Kollam and Tiruvalla is the fact that they both exist the way they do because of the income that rent seeking is generating, because of the income coming from tax, rent, and interest. So I have called this the rent seeking economy in one of my papers, and there is a promising historian in the making in IIT Mandi Aman Mishra, who was trying to develop this idea as perhaps holding the key to a richer understanding of urbanization in South Asia since the 7th century. He has already published a paper on Seodoni in the journal Urban History, in which he has made this argument. Now, as a student of history, I'm tempted to say that economic life in Kollam and Tiruvalla in the 9th and 10th centuries had nothing in common with economic life of Kollam and Tiruvalla today, nothing in common with economic lives of these centers in the year 2022. I don't think anyone will have a problem with this statement because they are two completely different worlds. But there is something that is common to both situations. In the 9th and 10th century, Kollam and Tiruvalla were what they were because of rent seeking. And that's true even today. That's true even today. Picture this. Let taxation remain in place, but let's take away rent and interest. Let's abolish them. Kollam and Tiruvalla won't be Kollam and Tiruvalla anymore. They'll both shrink and shrink and shrink like Detroit and Cleveland and St. Louis. So I think it's time we acknowledge that rent seeking was the most important driving force of India's economic history in the last 1500 years or so, and the most resilient force. It has survived the age of divine kingship and military fiscalism. It has survived colonialism, nationalism, and capitalism, and it is alive and bubbling today. So, in this sense, the Tarisapalli and Tiruvalla copper plates are not telling us only a story of the days when they were produced. They are also pointing to an important reality about our own lives. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.